Why does the end of the year make some people feel like they failed at life? My name is Paulo. I'm Brazilian. I'm 42 years old, and this is a quiet space I created to talk about things that are hard to say out loud. I'm not a therapist. I'm not here to give advice or solutions. I live with social anxiety, and I'm on the autism spectrum. And for most of my life, I've struggled to fit into a world that measures people by performance, speed, and visible progress. I made this channel in English because distance helps me speak more honestly, and because I know these feelings exist far beyond one country or culture. This is not a place for answers, it's a place for recognition. For as long as I can remember, my life has been deeply shaped by work and money. Not in a superficial way, and not because my parents were arrogant or obsessed with status, but because of how they were raised and what survival meant to them. My parents came from very little. What they built came from long hours, constant effort, and a deep fear of losing what they had achieved. So work wasn't just work in our house. Work meant safety. Work meant dignity. Work meant not going back to nothing. Money wasn't about luxury. It was about protection, stability, control in a world that felt unpredictable. Growing up, those ideas were never said in a cruel way. They were simply present, everywhere. Be strong professionally. Don't relax too much. Don't fall behind. Don't let others pass you. And because my parents worked in commerce, the end of the year carried a very specific weight. It wasn't just a date on the calendar. It was the most important moment of the year, the peak. The time when everything mattered more. Sales increased. Pressure increased. Expectations increased. The end of the year wasn't a time to slow down. It was a time to push harder. That rhythm entered my body very early, before I had words for anxiety or self-awareness. When I began working professionally, I didn't break away from that pattern. I stepped directly into it. I worked in my parents' company. Later, I opened my own business in the same field. Looking back, it's clear how intense that choice was for someone like me. I already struggled with social anxiety. I already felt overwhelmed by constant interaction, pressure, and performance. And I was already navigating the world with a nervous system that processed things more deeply and more slowly. And still, I chose commerce. A field built on constant exposure, constant comparison, constant urgency, especially at the end of the year. Back then, I didn't see this as a contradiction. I saw it as responsibility. I believed that pushing myself harder was the right thing to do. That discomfort meant growth. That pressure was normal. Over time, that belief became internalized. Even after I left that professional world, the end of the year never stopped being heavy for me. Something about this period forces me to stop and evaluate. Not gently, but harshly. What did I accomplish? What didn't I? Where should I be by now? And the most painful part is that this evaluation doesn't stay abstract. It becomes personal. I look at my life and feel that, objectively, I didn't conquer that much. Saying that out loud is still difficult, not because it's untrue, but because I was raised to believe that value is proven through visible results. Houses, cars, financial milestones. And when those markers don't appear, something inside me interprets that as failure. Every year, the same cycle returns. I look back and feel behind. I look forward and feel uncertain. The future doesn't feel open. It feels demanding. Questions start repeating themselves. How will I support my family? How will I provide for my daughter? How do I ensure stability when I don't feel stable inside? And beneath all of that, there's a deeper, quieter question. What does it actually mean to grow in life? Because for years, growth was defined for me in very concrete terms. More work, more money, more structure. But internally, my experience doesn't move in straight lines. Progress, for me, often looks invisible from the outside. It looks like surviving periods of intense anxiety, like staying present when everything inside wants to withdraw, like building something slowly while carrying fear and doubt. And yet, when the end of the year arrives, none of that seems to count. Only the visible markers matter. That's why this season feels so heavy for me. Not because I lack ambition. Not because I don't care. But because I care deeply, and I measure myself against a system that was never designed for someone with my inner rhythm. This isn't something I'm sharing for sympathy. It's simply the most honest way I can describe how this period sounds inside me. When I try to understand why the end of the year feels so heavy for me, I don't start with diagnoses or labels. I don't start by asking what's wrong. I start by paying attention to how my body reacts, how my thoughts shift, how time itself begins to feel different. Over the years, reading about anxiety, neurodivergence, stress, and nervous system responses helped me notice something important. Most of what we experience during periods like this doesn't happen because we are weak, lazy, or unmotivated. It happens because our nervous system is doing exactly what it learned to do. The body doesn't think in abstract terms like success or failure. It thinks in safety and threat. And for many people, especially those who live with long-term anxiety, the end of the year quietly activates a sense of threat. One of the first things that helped me understand this was realizing how differently anxious minds experience time. For some people, time feels open. The future feels flexible. The past feels like memory. But for anxious people, time often feels compressed and heavy. The past doesn't stay in the past. It becomes evidence. Instead of remembering experiences, the brain stores patterns. Moments when effort didn't lead to recognition. Times when trying harder didn't change outcomes. Periods when progress felt invisible. These memories don't sit quietly. They get reactivated when similar conditions appear again. So when the end of the year arrives, the brain doesn't just see December. It sees a repetition. It sees a familiar situation where evaluation, comparison, and expectation increase all at once. This is not symbolic. This is how threat-based learning works. The nervous system is designed to protect us by remembering what didn't work before, so it can prevent pain in the future. But when someone lives under chronic pressure, this system becomes biased. It stops asking, "What happened?" and starts asking, "What went wrong?" That's why the end of the year can feel less like reflection and more like judgment. Another piece that deeply changed how I understand myself is how anxiety alters attention. Anxiety doesn't just make you worry more. It changes what your mind notices. Research consistently shows that anxious brains are more likely to focus on uncertainty, potential failure, and social evaluation. Not because those things are objectively more important, but because they feel more dangerous. The brain highlights what it thinks could hurt you. So when society naturally invites comparison at the end of the year, anxious minds don't simply compare. They overcompare. They don't ask, "How did this year go overall?" They ask, "Where did I fall short?" And that question doesn't stay neutral. It carries emotion. It carries fear. It carries self-blame. For people with social anxiety, this effect is even stronger. Because social anxiety isn't only about people. It's about evaluation. Being seen, being measured, being judged. The end of the year turns life into a kind of silent performance review. Even when no one is actually judging you, the body reacts as if they are. Heart rate changes. Sleep becomes lighter. Thoughts loop more easily. This isn't a personality flaw. It's a stress response. For people on the autism spectrum, even lightly, there is often an added layer of complexity. Many autistic adults describe spending enormous energy simply translating themselves into the world, reading between the lines, adjusting tone, masking discomfort, trying to appear normal enough. This work is constant, and it's exhausting. But because it doesn't produce visible outcomes, it often goes unrecognized by others, and by the person themselves. When progress is measured only by external markers, like income, position, or visible growth, that internal effort disappears completely. The end of the year then becomes a moment of confrontation. You feel tired, but you don't see proof of why. That disconnect between effort and outcome is psychologically dangerous. It trains the brain to expect that effort won't be rewarded. Over time, this expectation turns into discouragement, and discouragement slowly turns into hopelessness. Another concept that helped me make sense of this experience is something called cognitive load. Cognitive load is the amount of mental effort required to function. For some people, daily life runs with a lot of margin. They have space to plan, adapt, and recover. For others, especially those dealing with anxiety or neurodivergence, daily life already operates close to capacity. Navigating social interactions, managing internal noise, processing sensory input, regulating emotions, all of this uses energy. When the end of the year arrives, it adds more demand. Evaluation, future planning, financial reflection, expectations about change. The system overloads. And when the system overloads, the mind doesn't produce nuanced thoughts. It produces simplified conclusions. I didn't change enough. I'm falling behind. I wasted time. These thoughts don't appear because they're true. They appear because the brain is tired. There's also something deeply human about how we internalize cultural narratives. We are taught, often indirectly, that life should move forward in a visible, upward direction, year after year. But psychologically, growth rarely follows a straight line. For people dealing with anxiety or autism, progress often looks like stabilization rather than expansion. Like learning how to cope, learning how to stay regulated, learning how to remain present instead of shutting down. These shifts don't show up on resumes or bank statements, but they are real, and they matter. Another important thing I learned is that the brain does not clearly distinguish between social threat and physical threat. Being evaluated, being compared, being judged. These experiences activate the same stress systems as danger. So when the end of the year turns life into a series of implicit evaluations, the body reacts accordingly. Muscle tension increases. Sleep becomes fragmented. Rumination intensifies. This is not weakness. It's physiology. Uncertainty also plays a major role here. Anxiety thrives in uncertainty. And the future, by definition, is uncertain. For people who already feel behind, imagining the future doesn't feel exciting. It feels risky. Thoughts about money, stability, family, and responsibility become heavier during this period. Not because disaster is coming, but because the brain is trying to prepare for it. The anxious mind fills gaps with worst-case scenarios, because certainty, even negative certainty, feels safer than open-ended hope. Understanding this changed the way I talk to myself. Instead of asking, "Why can't I handle this like other people?" I started asking, "What has my system been protecting me from all these years?" That question doesn't remove pressure, but it adds compassion, and compassion changes the internal tone. This isn't about lowering standards or giving up on growth. It's about recognizing that not all progress looks the same, and not all nervous systems experience time, work, and pressure equally. When I see it this way, the end of the year stops feeling like a final judgment. It starts feeling like a moment that exposes how much weight some people carry quietly, year after year. And that recognition alone can make the weight slightly easier to hold. There is a kind of pressure that becomes louder at the end of the year. It's not always spoken. Sometimes it doesn't even come from other people. It comes from time itself, from calendars closing, from numbers being counted, from that unspoken question that seems to float everywhere. So, what did you accomplish this year? For some people, this question feels motivating. For others, it feels neutral. But for people who live with intense anxiety, social anxiety, or neurodivergent traits like autism, this question can feel overwhelming. Not because nothing happened, but because what happened doesn't fit the expected shape of success. In the world we live in, professional life rarely stays just professional. It slowly becomes symbolic. Work stops being only about survival or contribution, and starts turning into a measure of worth. How much you earn, how fast you grow, what you bought, what you built, where you arrived. These markers become especially visible at the end of the year. They appear in conversations, family gatherings, social media posts, retrospectives, plans for next year. Even silence can feel judgmental. And when you live with anxiety, your mind doesn't filter this pressure. It amplifies it. One important thing to understand is that an anxious mind does not experience time in a neutral way. Anxiety changes how we relate to the past, the present, and the future. The past becomes evidence. The future becomes threat. And the present becomes a constant test, one that always feels slightly failed. So when the year ends, it isn't just a date. It feels like a verdict. The mind starts reviewing everything. What didn't move? What stayed the same? What failed? What never started? Even when there was effort, even when there was survival, even when there was resilience. The anxious brain rarely counts those things. This becomes even heavier for people like me. Because for someone dealing with anxiety or autism, functioning itself already costs energy. Showing up, regulating emotions, managing sensory overload, navigating social expectations, masking, all of this is work. But it's invisible work. It doesn't show up in bank accounts. It doesn't turn into promotions. It doesn't look impressive from the outside. So when the year ends and results are measured externally, something painful happens. You look exhausted and still feel like you have nothing to show for it. That distance between effort and outcome creates shame. Quiet shame, persistent shame. For many of us, this pressure didn't begin in adulthood. It was learned early. Growing up in families where work, money, and stability were central values creates a very specific internal voice. Not necessarily cruel, often loving, but firm, demanding, unforgiving. A voice that says, you need to be strong. You need to provide. You can't lose what was built. You can't afford to fail. When anxiety or neurodivergence enters this equation, something starts to break. Because the demand stays the same, but the internal capacity fluctuates. And at the end of the year, that voice gets louder. There's also a psychological reason why this pressure intensifies now. The brain likes narratives, beginnings, middles, endings. The end of the year creates an artificial sense of closure, as if life were a project that should be completed in 12 months. For anxious people, this is dangerous, because life is rarely linear for us. Progress comes in pauses, in detours, in internal shifts that don't translate into visible milestones. But the calendar doesn't care about that. It simply closes. And the anxious mind interprets that closure as failure. For people on the autism spectrum, even lightly, this pressure can feel even more confusing. Autistic cognition often seeks clarity, predictability, and logic. But society offers vague expectations. You should be further by now. You should have more stability. You should be somewhere else. Where exactly is that place? There is no clear map, only comparison. And comparison is brutal when your internal rhythm doesn't match the external tempo. One of the most painful aspects of this pressure is not the past, it's the future. Anxiety collapses time. You look back and feel behind. You look forward and feel hopeless. Thoughts start appearing. If it didn't happen now, it won't happen later. I'll never catch up. I'll always struggle. These thoughts feel logical when the nervous system is overwhelmed, but they are not predictions. They are stress responses. The brain, flooded with uncertainty, tries to reduce fear by assuming the worst. Because certainty, even negative certainty, can feel safer than hope. There is also a truth that is rarely acknowledged. The modern professional world is hostile to sensitive nervous systems. It rewards speed, exposure, constant networking, emotional toughness, and performance under pressure. People with anxiety or autism often operate differently. We need recovery time, emotional safety, predictability, meaning. When those needs are ignored, burnout becomes almost inevitable. And burnout doesn't always look like collapse. Sometimes it looks like stagnation, which society reads as laziness. This is where I want to be very clear. Struggling under these pressures is not a personal failure. Often, it is a mismatch between how your nervous system works and what the world demands from you. Understanding this doesn't remove responsibility, but it removes cruelty. And cruelty, especially self-cruelty, helps no one. This part of the video is not here to offer solutions. It is here to slow the narrative down, to interrupt the automatic conclusion that says, I failed another year. Before going further, it's important to sit with this truth. Survival is not nothing. Stability is not stagnation. Invisible work is still work. At some point, something subtle begins to happen. Not a solution, not a breakthrough, not a moment where everything suddenly makes sense, just a pause. a pause in the way the story has been told inside your head. For a long time, the narrative has been very rigid. If I didn't move forward, I failed. If I didn't grow, I wasted time. If I didn't arrive somewhere visible, I did nothing. But this story only works if life is linear. And for many of us, it never was. Especially for people with anxious minds, progress doesn't announce itself. It doesn't come with clear milestones. It doesn't show up neatly at the end of a calendar year. It happens quietly, internally, often in ways that are impossible to measure from the outside. Sometimes, progress is learning how to tolerate discomfort without collapsing. Sometimes, it's surviving a year that would have crushed you 10 years ago. Sometimes, it's staying present instead of Sometimes it's choosing not to abandon yourself, even when nothing seems to change. But when the world only recognizes visible movement, these shifts disappear. And when they disappear externally, the mind assumes they didn't happen at all. This is where a lot of unnecessary suffering begins. Because the anxious mind is already harsh. It already scans for mistakes. It already rewrites the past in the most critical way possible. So when the external world reinforces that story, through comparisons, expectations, and end-of-year narratives, the internal voice becomes even more severe. You don't just feel behind, you feel defective. And once that feeling settles, everything gets heavier. The future feels tighter. The present feels pointless. And the past feels like evidence against you. But there is another way to look at this, not a positive one, not an optimistic one, a more accurate one. A nervous system under constant stress does not evolve the same way as one that feels safe. It adapts, it compensates, it protects. And adaptation is not stagnation. Many people with anxiety or autism spend years building internal structures that are invisible to others. Ways to cope, ways to regulate, ways to stay functional enough to keep going. That work does not disappear just because it didn't turn into money, status, or visible achievements. It exists. And it matters. The problem is that modern life doesn't leave much room to acknowledge that kind of work. Especially at the end of the year, when everything is framed as a balance sheet. What did you gain? What did you lose? What do you have to show? There is very little space to say, I endured, I stayed. I learned how to carry what I couldn't change. But endurance is not weakness, and staying is not failure. In fact, for some nervous systems, staying is an act of strength that goes completely unrecognized. This doesn't mean that longing disappears. It doesn't mean frustration vanishes. It doesn't mean you stop wanting a different future. It simply means that the story becomes less violent. Instead of asking, why didn't I become who I was supposed to be? The question slowly shifts to, what did it actually cost me to be here? That question carries less blame, more honesty, more context. And context matters, because without it, the mind keeps replaying the same conclusion. I failed. But with context, another truth can exist at the same time. I struggled in a system that wasn't designed for how I work. Both things can be true, but only one of them destroys you. This is not about lowering standards. It's about stopping a measurement that was never fair to begin with. The end of the year will probably always feel heavy for people like us. Time markers will always activate comparison. The future will always raise questions. But the pressure doesn't have to turn into self-erasure. You are not late in life. You are not broken. And you are not failing because your path doesn't look like the dominant narrative. Some lives move outward. Others move inward first. And inward movement is not empty space. It's preparation. Even if it doesn't feel like it yet. If you're still here, listening to this until the end, I want to say something very simple. You're not alone in feeling this way. Even if your experience doesn't look exactly like mine. Even if your reasons are different. Even if the details don't match. That quiet pressure, that feeling of being behind, that weight that shows up when time starts closing chapters for you. None of that makes you weak. And none of that means you failed at life. This channel exists because I needed a place where these thoughts could exist, without being rushed, fixed, or judged. A place where complexity is allowed. Where slowing down is not treated as a flaw. I'm not here to give answers. I'm not here to offer solutions. And I'm definitely not here to tell you how to live your life. I'm here to speak honestly about how the world feels from the inside, and to let others know that this way of feeling exists. If any part of this resonated with you, if something here put words to something you've never quite been able to explain, then maybe this space can be useful to you too. You're welcome to stay. If you want to support this channel, you can like this video or subscribe. Not as a favor, but as a way of keeping this kind of conversation alive. And if you feel comfortable, you can share your experience in the comments, or send this video to someone who might need to hear it. Sometimes being heard starts with someone else speaking first. Thank you for being here.
There's a quiet weight in the air tonight, not heavy enough to fall, just enough to stay, like rooms we've walked through before, but never learned the names of. I don't need the world to slow down, I just needed to stop asking. I'm still here, even when nothing moves, still breathing in spaces without proof. I'm not lost, I'm just not loud, and that's enough for now. Some days feel smaller than they look, measured by things I didn't say. Time passes softly when no one's watching, and harder when it's being counted. I don't need a clearer map, I need gentler ground. I'm still here, even when nothing shows, still holding what no one knows. I'm not late, I'm just not fast, and that's enough for now. If I stay still, let it mean I stay, not that I disappeared. If I change quietly, let it count anyway. Still here in the space between, still human without a scene. I don't need to explain how I'm quietly here for now, for now. That's enough.